Welcome to TrineDay's The Journey, conversations with publisher Kris Millegan. Today's episode is The Ignored, people who say that Lee Harvey Oswald didn't kill Kennedy. I am Bruce the Taurus. With us are Judyth Vary Baker, who had a love affair with Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans in the summer of 1963. Judyth has written many books, including Me and Lee, How I Came to Know, Love, and Lose Lee Harvey Oswald, David Ferrie, Mafia Pilot, Kennedy and Oswald, The Big Picture, written with Edward Schwartz, and Lee Harvey Oswald and Me, The Weaponization of Cancer, the Monkey Virus, and the Kennedy Assassination. Also, Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould, husband and wife co-authors of Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story, their memoir, The Valediction, 3 Nights of Desmond, its sequel, The Valediction Resurrection, and the article From the Jerusalem Crusade to the Holy Grail, to the death of JFK, which examines how the immolation of Templar Grandmaster Jacques de Molay at the hands of the Pope's Inquisitors in 1314 would serve as an inspiration for generations to seek revenge on the Roman Church, beginning the legend that winds its way from Jerusalem to Paris, to the Holy Grail, to Scottish Rite Freemasonry, and to the death of JFK. Also, Christopher Fulton, co-author of The Inheritance, Poisoned Fruit of JFK's Assassination, about the key evidence in the assassination that passed from Bobby Kennedy to Evelyn Lincoln to Christopher, which caused him to cross paths with the Russian government, President Reagan, the Clinton White House, Donald Trump, and the Justice Department. Christopher made a pact with John F. Kennedy Jr. about the disposition of that evidence. The federal government silenced Christopher by brutally incarcerating him. Also, Ed Haslam, author of Dr. Mary's Monkey, How the Unsolved Murder of a Doctor, a Secret Laboratory in New Orleans, and Cancer-Causing Monkey Viruses are linked to Lee Harvey Oswald, the JFK assassination, and emerging global epidemics. Ed was raised in New Orleans and met Dr. Mary Sherman, whose 1964 death is the skeleton in the National Closet, the murder nobody wants to talk about. 60 Minutes producer Don Hewitt called Ed's revelations about the cancer in 200 million doses of the polio vaccine in the 1950s and the eruption of soft tissue cancers that followed the biggest story of our times. Also with us is Mal Hyman, author of Burying the Lead, The Media and the JFK Assassination, an updated review of the case, and a novel analysis of the way elite power works with the media in times of crisis. His book explains the rapid decline in confidence in government that began after the assassination. The mainstream media did nothing but repeat the official story. By 1991, they, along with academia and the government, had stopped investigating altogether. It took Oliver Stone's film JFK to fuel public outrage and cause Congress to pass the JFK Act to declassify the remaining documents that were still withheld. Also with us is William Matson-Law, author of In the Eye of History, Disclosures in the JFK Assassination Medical Evidence, At the Cold Shoulder of History, written with James Jenkins, a young Navy corpsman who was in the room during President Kennedy's autopsy, and Betrayal, a JFK Honor Guard Speaks, with the late Hugh Clark. William is the only private researcher to interview FBI agents James Siebert and Francis O'Neill, who also were in the room during the autopsy. William's JFK research has appeared in over 30 books, as well as his own. And James Latier, author of The Three Barons, the organizational chart of the Kennedy assassination, the first useful, in-depth analysis of the 120 phone calls made by Lyndon Johnson in the week following the assassination, regarding such things as demands made by the military and similar political power plays. The Three Barons is also the first use of statistical factor analysis to identify the plotters using a database of 30 books and 1,500 names. The book identifies why there were 3 actual barons involved in the plot and why at least 3 members of the Warren Commission had powerful Nazi connections, beginning in World War II and continuing through November 22nd, 1963. I wrote God School, 9/11 and JFK, The Lies That Are Killing Us and the Truth That Sets Us Free. And now, our host, an intelligence brat who has spent 50 years in conspiracy theory land, Kris Millegan.
Thank you very, very much, everybody, for showing up here and participating in this dream of mine of getting people together. I like discussion because I think we learn, and everybody brings something to the table. Not everybody can read every book, can read everything, can look at everything. One thing I learned at like the JFK conventions, I'd get people together, and yeah, they'd read each other's books, but when you got them together, there was magic that happened. That people learn things, and one reason that we survive as a species, okay, out in the woods in the middle of the night, not everybody was looking at the same direction, okay, and just because I found that somebody says something different than you, it doesn't mean that they're completely wrong. It just means that they have a different point of view. And another thing I mention at JFK convention sometimes, because people come in and they'll hear somebody say one thing, they'll hear somebody say almost complete the opposite, because the JFK assassination has been surrounded by purposeful mud, okay? Because when the people that pulled this thing off, they wanted to, say, well, it wasn't us, it was these people over there, it was those people over there. I was a ninth grade student in Spanish class when it all happened. And, they sent me out on the street selling newspapers. It was a very traumatic thing that happened here in our country. And it still affects what goes on here. And it's one of my posits that these, I call them the people in the shadows or the secret societal system, that I believe was responsible for this. One of the things that they're doing is they are trying to stuff down our throats that Lee Harvey Oswald killed Kennedy. Okay, I mean, and they want us to regurgitate that, because, if we regurgitate that, then, they're really in control, because we're just responding with a lie. I mean, it's just, it's deep psychological warfare. Okay, because it was a hit that separated us from our trusting our government. Okay, I mean, it's not that we should just trust government blindly, but we all have to live here on this earth. We have to get along together. We need some sort of a government so that we can all talk to each other. I didn't want to get all into the weeds, because there's a lot of weeds in the JFK assassination. But one thing I wanted to talk about is, I get calls from people say, well, I've got a manuscript I'm talking, about the JFK assassination. One of my first lines is, well, if you aren't saying that the Lee Harvey Oswald did it, then you aren't going to get any publicity. You aren't going to get any press. I mean, the only press of a book that I know that said that Lee Harvey Oswald didn't do it was Mortal Error, that says that a Secret Service guy a couple cars back, his gun went off accidentally and he shot the president. And that got, mainstream thing. But here, we've got Judyth Vary Baker, who knew Lee Harvey Oswald, knew a whole bunch of the people in New Orleans. Most of the people that she knew are dead, and she it's a lot of courage to come up and, she'd been slammed. I get, people, she's just making the whole damn stuff up and all this kind of crazy stuff. And, we spent 2 years vetting her, and I mean, just amazing documentation on it. And then, and then there's Ed Haslam, okay, who sat on Dr. Mary Sherman's lap as a kid and knew a lot of these people. And, I love going to New Orleans, besides being a musician. You get there, and it's such a friendly town. And as people tell me there, it's the largest small town because everybody knows everybody's business there. And so, Ed grew up in this, and he kept hearing these strange things, and they even fed a fake Judyth Vary Baker to Ed Haslam to find out what he knew. And with all this information, we can't break through. It just amazes me. And so one thing I wanted to start off with here and have Ed tell about the 60 Minutes story, because a lot of people don't know that 60 Minutes, okay, brought Judyth Vary Baker, okay, to New York, got her into the seat to sit, and they were about ready to shoot with the cameras, and the word came from top that, well, I guess not. You know, so Ed, you want to start this off, and thank you very much, Jim, Judyth, Paul and Liz and Ed and Kris and William and Mal for coming here. Thank you very, very much. Ed?
Well, in about 2000, which was before I met this Judyth Vary Baker, who's the real one, I got contacted by some people who didn't want to tell me who they were working with. I don't like to talk to people like that, you know. And I finally said, look, if you don't want to tell me who you're working with, I'm not interested in talking to you. And he said, well, we're with 60 Minutes. And I said, well, what do you want? You know, he says, well, this woman, and gave me a thumbnail of Judyth, and of course their thumbnail was focused on the sensational aspects of her story. And I said, well, send me some stuff, okay? And when I finally sat down and read it, and I recognized the name, Judyth Vary Baker, and I recognized the language in what she was talking about, which she did esoteric experiments with exotic chemicals. And that was all the exact language of this fake Judyth Vary Baker that I had been introduced to back in 1972. And 60 Minutes sent a producer who also happened to be a lawyer down to talk to me. And they didn't give me any of the evidence, which I didn't think was particularly fair or helpful. And the phone rang one day, and they said that they had dropped the story on Judyth, which didn't surprise me at all, because 60 Minutes is part of the establishment media that, you know, did all this stuff, you know, Walter Cronkite and all those people. And I managed to stay in contact with Judyth, and I happen to live in the town that Judyth was from, and I got together with her because it wasn't a question whether I believed her or not. I hadn't seen her evidence, you know. So we went out to lunch, and she brought these 3 ring binders, several of them, with her whole story detailed. What I found interesting was that she could prove that before 1963, she had an expertise in cancer and had received awards and financial support from big hitters. And she could reasonably explain to me how she got to know Dr. Alton Ochsner. You know, I lived in New Orleans for 35 years. I never met Ochsner. How does this girl from Florida know? You know, those kind of things. And 60 Minutes, you know, when they pulled the plug, I talked to somebody, and they sent me an internal email from 60 Minutes saying how disappointed they were because they were shut down from above.
Well, Judyth, you were in the chair 3 times. Can you tell your 60 Minute story?
Actually, 60 Minutes sent me to New Orleans, to Washington, D.C., and to Dallas, and of course to New York. We're talking about a period of 14 months. They tried 3 times to film. Each time, the first 2 times it was shut down. The 3rd time I had makeup on my face, and they shut it down. And the secretary for Dan Rather, well, she said she was working with Dan Rather. I had given her some Louisiana hot sauce, and we'd become friends, you know. She loves hot sauce. And she was so upset, and she wasn't crying, but she was on the verge of being very, very, she said, you know, Dan Rather shut this down. I want you to know that. he was way high up at that time. And Dan Rather had been sent to New Orleans just prior to the Kennedy assassination. The man was a new hire for CBS. He did a great report on hurricanes, and all of a sudden they sent him to New Orleans, and with, I'm sure, promises of advancement. He's there for 3 weeks, and somehow they send him then to Dallas the day that Kennedy's going to be shot, and he's the one that gets to see the Zapruder film. So he went to the top after reporting that he saw Kennedy's head thrown violently forward. Mm-hmm. And later, when he was accosted with the understanding that we had the Zapruder film now and it shows it going the other direction, he had the nerve to say, I must have seen it backwards.
Now, Mal, you're a professor, and your book is about, the media and the JFK assassination, and your book is, quite documented. How come they haven't told the truth?
Hey, you guys are the profiles in courage, and the media is the profile in cowardice. I grew up in a media family. A corporate-owned media doesn't talk about minimum wage on Labor Day. And if any of the stories that we've been working on, from political assassinations to 9/11, start to break, the government will be seen as illegitimate. So they shut these stories down. And CBS was on it from the outset, as was the Secret Service, to pick up the presidential, the report in Parkland Hospital from Malcolm Kilduff, to make sure that the public didn't understand that Kilduff had been told by the surgeon that the president was killed by a wound to the head. The Secret Service tracked down that information. The FBI visited different newspapers in Dallas to shut down the information and spin the story. CIA assets were used from day one. I had an interesting conversation with Dr. Locke Johnson, University of Georgia, who had sat on Senator Church's committee to look into the CIA back in 1976. And I said, in your report, you say the CIA had connections with the media, and there were 400 to 600 reporters that worked with the CIA in one form or another. And he said at least that many. That report is still classified, as is the information on the assassination of Martin Luther King. I mean, we're really up against the corporate media. And I'd say that Fox is not really a media outlet, it's a propaganda outlet that would make Goebbels envious. They use all of the strategies and tactics used by Goebbels, whether it's constant attack or the big lie or repetition or the appearance of diversity. And I will say, ironically and of great concern, the notions from the far right about the deep state and the media as the enemy of the people are being used on Fox, and they're actually showing pictures of Kennedy at this point in some of their stories and talking about government and media cover-ups. So the mass media has been tied to the CIA intelligence apparatus owned by billion-dollar conglomerates for a long time. And we have to work even harder to get our message out through alternative methods.
Yeah, I'm very hopeful that, we can push some of these media figures beyond their corporate overlords. That was one thing that happened in Canada when the Bilderberg group were there and were trying to divide Canada into English and French parts. And reporters went against Conrad Black and started to report about it. So, I am hopeful that individual people will stand on their own 2 feet. Now, Paul and Liz, Paul, you have a lot of experience working with the media, and Paul was working with CBS, and they sent him to Afghanistan, and he found that his reporting wasn't really
appreciated.
Yes, yes. And then Paul also is a Fitzgerald, and he's related to Honey Fitz, who was JFK's grandfather. So he's had some interesting looks at the Kennedy assassination. You want to just talk a little bit about your experience with the media?
Well, growing up in the Boston area and being a Fitzgerald was kind of like, I walk into an event, my friends, the Dunphys, and everybody would look at me and go, oh, they sent the Irish Mafia tonight, things like that. It was always there. I started out at Boston University in 1969 and kind of got sidetracked into theater for a few years because I was a good singer. Decided to get back into journalism. So I wound up getting a show on Channel 25 in Boston, which was just a public 2 chairs and a plant and me. That was it. But it gave me the opportunity, gave me the platform to be able to bring in all these people that I had worked with on a congressional campaign, and interesting people up here in Boston. My cousin had run for the Senate, the congressional seat held by Torby McDonald, and Torby McDonald had been JFK's roommate in college at Harvard. We went out, we worked for my cousin, we got him elected to Congress in 1976. We get into the middle of this maelstrom that was going on. The Vietnam War had just ended. Everybody was getting politically active and saying, this guy Carter's really gonna make a difference. This is a whole new look for the Democratic Party. So I wound up, ironically, at Pat Robertson's affiliate in Boston, which had just come in. It was a Christian broadcasting effort, but they needed somebody to do public affairs. So I had a weekly television show for the next 3 years in which Liz and I started to cooperate. We started to buy our own equipment. We started to go out and ask people for, and do things that, needless to say, Pat Robertson wasn't going to be doing. Robertson was airing this documentary 3 or 4 times a day from the National Security Council, or the American Security Council. And it was about how terrible Carter was and how terrible the SALT agreement was, and that we were going to get invaded by the Russians at any moment. So I went to the manager and I said, look, we got to do something about this. This is in violation of every rule that the FCC has put out. We have to do something in opposition to this. He said, okay, fine, do something. So anyway, so I went out and we got John Kenneth Galbraith, and we got Paul Warnke, the guy who negotiated the treaty with the Soviets, the SALT treaty. So we put together a documentary, and lo and behold, the Russians invade Afghanistan. And everything suddenly goes from day to night. All of a sudden, all the people who had been out there lobbying for a huge defense budget suddenly came forward and said, see, we told you. We weren't being hard enough. SALT was showing our weakness to the Russians, and here they go, and they invade a country nearby for the first time since World War II. We have to have this enormous Reagan agenda. So we have this documentary out there advocating SALT, running around. Liz is making phone calls to CNN, and CNN had just got on the board. They were doing all kinds of things that the networks weren't doing. And so there was nobody to sell this story to. We literally were out of business. So at any rate, I said, let's see what we can do to go to Afghanistan. They had shut down the Western media 10 days after the Soviets invaded. So we didn't know who had shut it down or why they shut it down, but it was just playing right into the mainstream media's hands at that point. So we made some inquiries, and we wound up meeting an ambassador from the UN ambassador from Afghanistan. And I made my pitch. I said, you guys are getting killed in the media. I mean, CBS News, ABC. He says, oh, I know. He says, we get weekly requests from them. They want to get permission to go in. We waited a year. I think it was a year and 9 months or so, I think it was. And lo and behold, they gave us the permission.
And well, that was opened the door basically to CBS News and Peter Larkin, who was the foreign editor for CBS News. And so that is how we entered into the mainstream sort of at the highest level, because that was a story that none of them could get. So once we got that opportunity to actually be the first TV crew to go to Afghanistan, this is where we discovered, the mainstream agenda versus the actual function of journalism. We really believed that the story that they were going to put on was going to be about what we actually discovered when Paul got to Afghanistan. This would have been in May of 1981. And what he discovered there was that it was not Saigon. It was not Russia's Vietnam. And in fact, there was an Afghan government that was really in charge and that had some kind of relationship with the Soviet Union that was actually being used as proof that the Soviet Union was really trying to take over Afghanistan. So what we discovered, I'm sure no one's going to be surprised to hear this, what we discovered was completely at odds with what became the mainstream story. And I'd like to point out that that story, I think most people today, probably right here, I would be surprised if anyone hasn't seen or read Charlie Wilson's War, the story about the U.S. representative who got a lot of funding for the Mujahideen Holy Warriors in the 1980s. And that is the sum and substance of the mainstream story. That became the sum and substance of not just CBS News. We actually went back to Afghanistan with Roger Fisher from the Harvard Negotiation Project 2 years later. He was going to try to convince the Soviets to be negotiated out. What we all discovered when we landed in Kabul in 1983 was that the Soviets were desperate to get out. And when we brought the story back for Nightline, which is who we had done it for, we discovered that Nightline did not really want that story to be told. So Roger Fisher, who was an internationally recognized negotiator, was basically pretty much set up to fail. In fact, when you mentioned Dan Rather actually was in charge of CBS at that point. He was the managing editor for CBS. We, of course, knew about his role in the JFK assassination issue. So, we were just finding the constant referencing of the narrative that they want. So I guess at this point, we can't be that surprised that of all things, the JFK assassination would fall into this vortex and be as controlled as every story that is of any significance.
Right. Now, William, you have done some amazing work. Because there are people, they were there. I mean, James Jenkins. I mean, imagine yourself a 21-year-old Navy corpsman, the president's body's on the slab, and, they say, okay, turn him over, put the bucket underneath so that you can catch what's left of his brain. The thing that's great about William is, a lot of these people, they'd been interviewed by some people before, and then the person would take what they said in the interview and then spin it, to the writer's advantage. And what these people, that were there, found out that William would just take their words and then report their actual words and what they had to say instead of spinning it. So he ended up as the go-to guy for a lot of these people when they wanted to tell their story. And there's some amazing people. I mean, Dennis David, I wish, he's passed, but he was just one of the sweetest guys you ever met. And he, was the guy who took the coffins at the Bethesda, and he had to tell the people, actually we received a coffin, 30 minutes or so before the hearse came there. So William, tell a little bit of your story, and how have you talked to reporters? Have they been knocking on your door?
I did talk to one reporter that I was assured was gonna delve into my book and really report things. And when I called him and told him who I was, he said, I think that the reporters that reported on this story and the doctors that were there no more than people that were around the autopsy table. And so therefore, I'm going to have to go with what they know.
can you tell us some of the most amazing things that have come from your interviews of these people who were involved with the autopsy and other things?
Half of my first book is about, not quite half, talking to FBI agents that were told by J. Edgar Hoover to stay with Kennedy's body after the assassination and take the evidence back to the FBI laboratory. And many, many people had tried to get these guys to talk and were unable to do that. It took me 3 years from beginning to end, but I did manage to get them to talk to me. Francis X. O'Neill was not a very friendly guy. He would tell me things that would lead you to believe that Kennedy had been killed other than Lee Harvey Oswald, that there was more than one shooter. But he would always go back around and talk in circles that it was Lee Harvey Oswald. At the ending of our first conversation, I remember him saying, well, don't you think the Kennedys would have spent every last dime to find out who shot their relative? And Jim Seibert, who was Francis X. O'Neill's partner that night in the morgue, taking 5.5 pages of notes, I was the first to get into his house, and I'm the first person to put him on camera, and I'm really proud of that. And so I have him on camera, and he's holding up an oversized picture of the so-called stare of death photograph that shows President Kennedy on the morgue table. And he's looking at this thing and he says, you know, I've often wondered, whoever that shooter was, if he used an exploding bullet. So despite all of it was Oswald, when I got him in the room and he got comfortable, he would say things like that. And staring at the back of the head photograph, and he said, no, I don't remember seeing anything this clean. They must have done this work after the mortician started on the body. This is not what I remember. Going to Jim Jenkins, when I got Jim Jenkins to talk to me, I flew to New Orleans after being in the room with him for a while. He didn't want to be filmed. I'd flown all the way there, and in talking to him, he said, you know, I would just soon sit here and have our drinks and talk to you about it, but I don't want you to film me. And I looked so disappointed that he took pity on me, and he looked at me for about 10 seconds. He was looking me straight in the eyes. And he said, all right, William, I'll do it for you. Oh. So I took him up to the room, and I set the camera up. And we were talking about various things, and he said, he said, Humes, he made a statement. He said, that damn thing fell out of my hands, meaning Kennedy's brain. And I said, well, what does that mean to you, Jim? And very quietly looking right at me, he says, what I think that means is that the president's brain was removed and then replaced. Mm. Now I'm sitting, across this table, and I'm trying to act like professional, and I hear this kind of stuff every week. So what I wanted to do was fall off the chair. Those are the kind of things that, catch you by surprise. It's one thing to read in a book that they said something and that this happened. But when you're sitting in a room with someone that was involved in an event like this, and you're looking at them and they're looking at you and they say something like that, it's a whole different experience. Wow. It stunned me to the core.
Mm-hmm. Chris Fulton, you kind of, I can't say stumbled upon all of this, but it kind of definitely intruded into your life, the Kennedy assassination. And a lot happened to you. And you want to tell a little bit of your story and the reaction from people and the reaction from the media.
Well, first off, I'd like to thank everybody here for your efforts in the truth. to the people of the United States and to around the world. Yet your efforts are appreciated by myself. Our national security state has overridden just about every truth that we have. And that's part of the reason why, and I had to go to prison for what I did, and part of the reason why you've been blocked in every efforts you've had for the truth to come out. I was put in a position at the time that I had evidence, we had evidence enough to change the narrative on this story officially, and we were not allowed to do that. One of the reasons we weren't allowed to do that was because it undermines what the national security state is placed into the official record. The official record of the Kennedy assassination cannot be released to the American public. That's because the truth has been removed and been replaced with a story that would take us to nuke war. So it puts myself and all of you in great jeopardy if you come close to changing that narrative. Bobby Kennedy had realized what had happened to his brother and was in a position that he couldn't do much about it till he could reach the office of the White House. And even then, it would be difficult to negotiate with the foreign powers necessary to make it right. He knew that he didn't have a very strong chance of getting in there, but he also knew that the craziness going on with the nukes going over to Egypt, and the fact that we were on the precipice as a nation, he had to take the chance in '68. So I feel very strongly about anyone that puts their life on the line for the truth and liberty, and for our generations to come, and for the future of our children. That's what I did. At the time they brought me in under a national security ticket and put me in prison, I didn't care very much what had happened to me at that juncture. I figured my life was over. I also feel very strongly about the January 6ers that are doing time right now. I understand what they're going through. And the fact that they're taking their own lives. I've seen that happen where I was. You can't face the fact of what your nation is doing to you personally. And you can't face the fact of the time, the loss. It's overwhelming. But I could tell you from looking at the evidence that was in my possession that the official story was changed and altered. I talked to Mr. Bauk of the Secret Service, who admitted to me that he was ordered to change evidence and flush evidence down the toilet, and that the story had to be the right narrative for the American people. The Warren Commission was put out, not for the American public, but to disassociate Russia and put them at ease with the Johnson administration. So all of this has been a sham from the very beginning. And anyone who delves into the truth of this is not allowed to follow through. The Justice Department, I spoke to them directly. Same with the Central Intelligence Agency. No one's going to be prosecuted on this, and they're not going to pursue this in any means, because it will undermine the legitimacy of the United States government. I think that the same narrative that President Kennedy had been dealt through the City of London, which was to go to war with Russia and China, to nuke both, so that the City of London could then push their pressure to bear on the rest of the world, is the same narrative we're working with now. It's no different. It doesn't change. And that's why you see us dealing with Russia and China the way we are now. But they can't bring the official record of the Kennedy assassination out, even though Mr. Trump had tried to do that and so forth and so on. When they see the official record, if they release that without going through the negotiations and the ability to keep us from war, it's a too great a national security risk, and therefore it's not going to ever be just released like that. John Jr., who was going to be drafted by the DNC and to be taken directly to the White House without an official record through Congress or the Senate, knew all of this and was taking this on his shoulders. I thought that was the right thing to do, to support his effort and to help him achieve this. But of course, I was put in prison, debriefed, and he was murdered. I feel sorry for every American and everyone around the world. And I feel sorry for the children and their future that they're facing now. We have a responsibility to try to set this straight. And it's we, the people, that is going to do this. It's not going to be our elected officials, because they've been placed in a position where they're bribed and they're compromised. And so therefore it's up to us. And if we all stand together in truth and are strong enough, strong men and women that had gone through the World War II, the generation that raised me, then we could change the world.
Looking to do that. Mr. Latier, you gave quite an exposition in your book. You showed quite a few different things. And one of the things that you talked about is something that Ed Haslam was the first person to bring up, was that Lee Harvey Oswald wasn't, just running around for the fair play for Cuba, but he was being used by lots of different people to infiltrate organizations. And, Ed brought up the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald was working out of Robert Kennedy's office. Okay. And, you think about it too. I mean, Lee Harvey Oswald was a quote unquote defector, right, in Russia. And then he had to come back into the United States. And there's some people that had to sign on a piece of paper. And one of the last persons to sign on that piece of paper would have been the Attorney General. So can you tell a little bit about Lee Harvey Oswald's extracurricular activities?
Well, I did cooperate a little bit with Dr. Jeffrey Caulfield, who wrote the book on General Walker, going through the personal papers of a guy named James Dombrowski, because Dr. Caulfield thought that Oswald was an informant working for James O. Eastland in New Orleans, and that the purpose of that was to paint the civil rights movement as communist. And we were looking for the mention of the unknown informant who was working with Eastland. Dr. Caulfield thinks it was Oswald. I couldn't find Oswald's name, but it seems pretty obvious he was working with Senator James O. Eastland in the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee as an informant in that respect. And of course, then he was working on the cancer project, I guess. And then he tried to go to Clinton, Louisiana to infiltrate the civil rights movement, which is another thing that backs up the theory that he was working with Eastland. So that's just one thing. And there's others.
Right. Well, Ed Haslam, can you flesh out Lee Harvey Oswald a little bit in like his travels, where he was like using an airplane and stuff, and he went to Tennessee and all these other things?
Well, there's a lot there. One of the things I'm most conscious of was the fact that I think it was July 25th, 1963, he goes to the Atomic Energy Museum in Knoxville, Tennessee, and signs the guest register as Lee Harvey Oswald, Dallas Road, Dallas, Texas, and that's writes USSR over his name, like, pay attention, FBI, I'm trying to tell you something, okay? Now, we know his movements immediately before that, which were in New Orleans. He was with Judy at David Ferrie's apartment. And immediately after that, he gets in a car driven by his Uncle Dutz, and they drive over to Mobile, Louisiana, where he gives a speech to the Jesuits about life in the USSR. Now, you can't do that with a car. You have to have an airplane in order to go from New Orleans to Knoxville, Tennessee, and back in 24 hours, okay? And then September 25th, which was Lee's last day in New Orleans, he has breakfast with Clay Shaw and some people. Guy Bannister's partner, Judy, what's his name?
Hugh Ward.
Hugh Ward. And Hugh drives him down to the blimp base in Houma, Louisiana, where there's a twin-engine plane called a Dove, de Havilland Dove, waiting for him. And they fly him from New Orleans to capital of Texas, where he goes into the governor's office and picks up some money. and then goes back, gets in the plane. I mean, I'm skipping a lot of details here, but then he flies up to Dallas to make sure his family's okay. They drive by his house, make sure the car's there and stuff. Then he flies down to Sugarloaf Airport in Houston, right outside of Houston, Texas.
It's Hull Field.
Yeah, and they take him over to the bus station where he gets on the bus for Mexico. Now, the interesting part is that, according to the Warren Commission, there are all these witnesses who see him on the bus from Houston to Laredo and Laredo to Mexico City, but nobody sees him on the bus from New Orleans to Houston. That's because he wasn't on the bus. His luggage was on the bus, but he wasn't. Okay, so to me, one of the amusing things is all this stuff about Clinton, Louisiana, and Jackson, Louisiana, where nobody can seem to agree on the dates on what happened. Well, you know, it's not that difficult. Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech on August 28th. So the Congress on Racial Equality sets up a voter registration drive in the county seat, or parish seat, as they call it, Louisiana, at Clinton, Louisiana. You know, it was the day after the Martin Luther King speech, which made it August 29th. And Judy comes along and says, yeah, we drove up there August 29th, you know. And one thing I want to say while I got the microphone here is, since we're talking about Lee and the assassination, number one, I don't think Lee killed Kennedy, okay?
Yeah.
You know, I just want to say it outright, all right? And number two, he didn't kill Tippit. He didn't kill Kennedy because he was in the lunchroom when Kennedy got shot getting changed to buy a Coke, and he didn't kill Tippit because he was already in the Texas Theater at the time Tippit got killed, okay? And then somebody says, well, so how do you tie that to the CIA and the mob and all this crazy stuff? Well, I got a book right here, TrineDay published it here. It's Self-Portrait of a Scoundrel by Chauncey Holt. And Chauncey's the guy that made the fake Secret Service IDs for Daley Plaza. He was asked to do it by his CIA boss. But who else was Chauncey? He was Meyer Lansky's accountant and bodyguard. He's the guy that killed Bugsy Siegel. You know? I mean, that's 1 foot in the CIA and 1 foot in the mob, bringing this stuff to Daley Plaza. And then he's told to go hide in a boxcar, which is full of weapons. Did you know there was a boxcar full of weapons right behind the Daley Plaza? You know, I just find all that so obviating, if I can put it that way, you know. And Chauncey even walked down to the corner out in front of the school book depository. Chauncey, by the way, also ran a school for mercenaries. He was in the middle of this mercenary thing. He recognized so many people on the corner out in front. He said it looked like a meeting of mercenaries, the Soldier of Fortune crowd, you know. The guy who you see in the pictures with a cigar, who brought Lee out of the Texas Theater, right? Well, he was a CIA plant at the Dallas Police Department who 12 months later, we find him working in the Saigon Police Department in South Vietnam.
Oh, God.
Now, you want to figure out how that happens?
Yeah.
Let's get this guy out of town, you know?
Right. Well, you know, Daniel Marvin, okay, was our second book, you know, and I knew he had some, you know, relationship to the JFK Association. So when I first heard that he wanted to do a book, I thought that was going to be it. But, you know, he wanted to do this book about his time in Vietnam. You know, he was the only lieutenant colonel that I know that didn't graduate from high school because he was an assassin. And he mentioned that in Dallas that he heard that, you know, there was so many, you know, assassins there. Okay. And it's a way for the intelligence services to put another hand on their shoulder, because a bunch of them weren't involved. Some weren't involved in it, but they were there. And so the CIA says, well, now, you know, how are you going to explain that you were in Dallas that weekend? Because you've got other things that you aren't supposed to talk about. Now, I want to open this up to discussion here. And so just kind of put your hands up and you can talk. Judyth, how did I know your hand was going to be first?
Because there are some statements that are being made that based on what they know, but that are not quite accurate. I'd like to talk about what really happened to Clinton just very briefly.
Okay.
We have Joan Mellon saying that Clay Shaw, the busiest man probably in the whole world at that time, who didn't take off any time at all from trade march, suddenly has what Mellon and others thought was a 3-day excursion over to Clinton for some reason to get Lee Oswald enrolled as a voter so that he could get a job at a mental hospital so later they could accuse him of being a mental case. Now just think about the illogical reasoning of this. Shaw driving 110 miles up there and all that. They put him, he's supposed to get his voter registration, but it's all from parish of New Orleans. It's not from, you know, it's not from East Feliciana parish. And of course he gets turned down. So why would they also sit there? Everybody can see them. The town marshal goes over and finds out Clay Shaw there of the International Trade of the Trade Mart. That's his Cadillac he's driving and so on. They've got all this ID. Why are they sitting there instead of dropping him off and going around the corner to a coffee shop, waiting for him to enroll if that's what he was doing? That's not why he was there. He actually had to sit there because the only payphone in the whole town happened to be at the telephone exchange across from the courthouse. They were waiting for a telephone call and they were delayed. And they had to sit there almost 3 hours and they can't move because prisoners were coming up from Angola prison and they were going to be transferred to Jackson Mental Hospital to be tested on this material, okay? And the thing is that the people going to do the testing are in the Cadillac. Why are they in the Cadillac? So they can join this group and look like an official convoy going in. They're going to, the first car, they're going to get their ID for it, and they're going to let the whole convoy, and they're not going to stop each car in the convoy. So the bottom one has Clay Shaw in it. He's got money. He's got stuff going on because they're not going to do these experiments up there without money, okay? Number two, David Ferrie is there. Why in the heck is he there? Of all people, you can't miss him with the big eyebrows. And they tried to say it was Guy Bannister. Of course, it's ridiculous because they don't look anything like the same guy. And David Ferrie was there because no doctor wanted to do these injections, but David Ferrie knew how. So he was there to teach the clinicians up there how to inject and what kind of X-ray and all that. Why would Lee Oswald be there? Lee Oswald is going to take this material to Mexico City. That was the original plan, to get it dropped off to Cubans who would go and make sure that that Castro would be injected with this biological weapon. Now, by the way, I've got lots of information on showing that we did do gain of function. We did everything they're doing now. In fact, I'm getting interviews like crazy now because once they establish stuff like that. Now, why would Lee Oswald be there? Because nothing has to be written down. He has to listen orally. He has to watch how the injections are made so he can go and tell the people that his contacts, okay, Castro, anti-Castro contacts, pretending to be pro-Castro, and they're medically trained, but nothing's written down. So he had to be there. Now, why is he standing in a voting line? Because they're sitting in a car and he can't stand being stared at. You know, all the people are all lined up here. They thought nobody would be there. It's just middle of the week. Martin Luther King speech was the day before, and Cora's there, and all these people lined up, and they can't hide and they cannot leave that phone. So that's really what happened. And Lee gets out of the car because he doesn't want to be stared at. And this woman comes by and she's crying. He said, what's the matter? She had got an AA degree at Tuskegee Institute.
They wouldn't let her vote.
Yeah, so she goes in and they give her a literacy test and have her read part of the Constitution. Then they told her she failed it. Lee said, I can't believe this. She said, I'll bet I could take my ID, because I'm white, from the New Orleans parish. I'll get in. I'll bet they'll sign me up. I can get them. I can do that. Because they won't let her in. So sure enough, he goes in. They do. He signs the register. He just flashes the stuff. Yeah, okay, sign, just like that. And then he said, I'm so glad now that I am resident of East Feliciana Parish, because I was just New Orleans. They said, what in the hell did you sign that for? You know, and so they erased it. All right. But we had investigators from Garrison Investigation went there and looked, and you could still see the O and all that for Oswald. They couldn't. So they reported on that, went back up to get it, was gone, of course, that page.
Mal, what you're a professor, and now you say you got a class coming up, so you've got to leave pretty soon. In listening to what you've heard here, what are your thoughts?
There's so much important information that needs to come out to the public. We have invited the mass media to conferences for the last 30 years that I've been active on the case. I'm not sure how we can get even an MSNBC to start to pay attention. Maybe our conference on the Martin Luther King assassination will be the wedge in April with someone like a Joy Reid. We know at the 9/11 conferences that people have come up with information that's vital for a democracy. The CIA and the drug trade, that material never really got out. It's sometimes hard to know where to start, but I think most change in this country comes from the bottom up, not from the top down. When the people lead, the leaders will follow. And I'm reminded of James Madison saying, popular government, well, access to popular information is but a prologue to a tragedy, a farce, or both. So we just have to keep plugging away, and hopefully we'll get some breaks on this, because I do believe the truth will set us free.
Bruce, that's your cue.
Mal, if you recall what Christopher Fulton described, like a very big picture of what's at stake with this national security stake, ushered in arguably from the Kennedy assassination.
Oh, I think this has been vital. We're in a constitutional crisis that's gone on since the January 6th insurrection. And we're seeing whether a government of laws is able to try to rectify itself, even a most modest extent. I think, the Edward Snowden material that came out made clear just how far the NSA has gone. I think we have not had an investigation of the CIA and FBI for decades. And I think we drift at our peril, and we never know when our stories are going to resonate. But I think it's absolutely vital to strengthen a democracy that we keep plugging away. I don't think there's any shortcut on this. I'm reminded of activists in the civil rights movement, the liberation theology movement, people working on 9/11. Everybody feels like they're in a fog and they're not sure how to break through. And I think efforts like this are a part of it. But I think the constitutional crisis, if we were in France, we'd say our republic ended in 1963. Mm-hmm. And we'd be in a new republic. And I think most of the public would agree with us. Academe doesn't take this seriously because it would change their paradigm. The media, the mass media, even MSNBC isn't asking these questions. So it is hard to know how to proceed. And I think there's leadership shown by everybody that's part of this discussion. We've all had our struggles with the powers that be. And I don't think there's any simple answer. We keep struggling. I'm reminded of Martin Luther King didn't know where to go next either. And they took their best guess and they just kept fighting. That's probably the story of Francis Marion and the founding of the Republic. And my hat's off to all of you for the journeys that you've taken in the name of truth and democracy.
And I would add, this 60th anniversary year of 1963 is such a ripe time for all of us and everyone listening to highlight the truth about JFK's assassination and connect it to the perilous condition we're in right now. I'll invite everyone to check out TrineDay's roundtables and this effort that Paul and Liz and Kris are spearheading to raise awareness along these lines and to leverage the King's upcoming coronation. Just ring this bell. It's like Christian evangelists. It's like find someone today who didn't think about or talk about the JFK assassination in their lifetime. Wake up every morning and evangelize and tell the story and tell the story and tell the story. And obviously that's what we're all endeavoring to do with all our labors.
Paul and Liz, I want you to tell a little bit of the story of the Knights Templar, the 11/22 date, and it fits into the posit that I've had for a long time, in that this was a psychological hit on the American people. It's just like when you look at mind control, one of the things that they do is they try and smash a person to split their personality apart, okay? Because when it happened, we pretty much all knew that Lee Harvey Oswald didn't do it, but they kept that narrative going, and so they've got this lie out there, but we all knew that the perpetrators got away with it and were clinking their glasses at happy hour. So there's this psychological warfare, big part of it, to separate us from our government, to separate us from trusting other people. And the Fitzgeralds, well, tell a little bit of the Fitzgerald story, and then the Knights Templar and the date.
Okay, well, I'm going to give a little bit of background on the Fitzgerald legacy and how it really led to this larger story of the Templars and Jacques de Molay, and the suppression of the Templars on November 22nd, and why that date is so important, when basically people who are very invested in Masonic beliefs and created this country consider November 22nd to obviously be a very real date to actually specifically bring someone like JFK. And that goes back to the original crisis that the Fitzgerald family encountered with London that led to the eventual genocide of the Fitzgerald family, the Fitzgerald lines in Ireland by the Elizabethans. So when you bring in the kind of engagement that would lead to a genocide, that would lead to basically, the suppression of the entire family, all its lands were confiscated, and so on, and completely dispossessed. I like to say they basically went into the land, and they've been there for 400 years waiting to be resurrected, and that's what we're trying to do. And I think JFK himself carried the power of that legacy. So when you tie it to the ancient history that goes back to the Knights Templar, and they're being suppressed by Rome, there is actually a relatively loose association to the idea that it was really the Catholics against basically the Church of England, and that became the conflict, because there was more than that going on between the Fitzgeralds and London.
Well, it was, as Liz said, it's complicated because it wasn't just the Church of England either. It was this Puritan faction, and it was also this ancient Gnostic faction that was rising at that particular time, that Walter Raleigh and that Spencer, I didn't know that Spencer's Fairy Queen was all about the war. The White Knights were the Elizabethans, and the Black Knights were the Fitzgeralds, and the various characters were related to the last Earl of Desmond, and that they were being painted in this propagandistic way in magical terms. And I read it in school as an English major when I went to Boston University, and I thought, this stuff sounds very strange. What is this all about? Well, as I got more involved in the politics, I began to see that this thing with the Fitzgeralds went back to 1066. And it may have even gone back further than that there was something being carried forward from generation to generation. And the only reason I became aware of it was because everybody kept saying, oh, you're one of those guys. We went to Cuba on our honeymoon. And somebody looks at me and goes, you're one of them, aren't you? I said, one of who? Who is this all about? I'm radiating some kind of thing that's happening. But the fact is that, there was a book somebody put out many years ago about the Templars. The Templars were in opposition to what the Fitzgeralds represented. And I believe the name of the book was The Murdered Magicians. And I think that the people who set up this country were connected to that, proudly connected to the fact that they were connected to the Templars, and that whether real or mythological, the fact is the mythology was very powerful, is very powerful. And for some reason, I found myself connected to it. I grew up in a town where, de Molay girls were there on Saturday night at the dances. And, we have an Oddfellow Lodge in the center of town. And it turns out that, I'm reading another one of your TrineDay author's books, and he talks about William Buckley. I graduated from Stoneham High School in 1969, Stoneham, Massachusetts. William Buckley graduated from Stoneham High School in 1957. I'm sorry, 1947. My brother graduated from it in 1954. It's the same organization, the same church we belong to. And I realized that I found myself kind of like something was expected of me as I walked down this aisle called life, and that it had already been prepared for me becoming aware of. So that's my connection to the Fitzgerald thing. We bumped into it in a number of cases. There is an opposition here. This magical issue goes back, if you read all the chronicles about the Fitzgeralds coming to Ireland in 1169, and the separation between the two branches of the Fitzgerald family, the Kildare and the Desmond branch. And the Desmond branch is what JFK, my grandfather and JFK's grandfather were related. That's where they come from. This area is mystical. Liz and I went back to Ireland in 1997 with my family, and one of my father's cousins set up an interview with the Knight of Glyn. There were 3 knighthoods in the family. We go over and we visit the Knight of Glyn, and we discover that the Knight of Glyn is actually the Black Knight. And first thing he says to Liz when she walks into the castle, "What were you thinking when you joined this crazy family?" And what did Liz say?
He didn't know my family.
Kennedy said, what? The great enemy of truth is very often not the lie, deliberate, contrived, and dishonest, but the myth, persistent, pervasive, and unrealistic. Belief in myths allows the comfort of opinion without the discomfort of thought. Where would our country be if JFK had lived?
Well,
our golden age would have continued.
Well, we've thought about that so much, because this is the core of why our focus right now is, rather than on his assassination, is on his resurrection. That's exactly the reason, because we feel he still is alive, that he is still so much of an inspiration for us being here right now, still caring enough to try to figure it all out. But there is a point at which you have to take something positive out of it. You can't just look at trying to find out who killed him. We have to take that power and bring it back. So that is the reason why we are trying to create a world peace plan based on JFK's 1963 American University speech.
I'd just like to insert, if it's all right, that the reason all of a sudden I'm getting my calendars filled with interviews. I mean, I had to find time to get here. Everything has changed because Elon Musk opened up Twitter. All of us were suppressed. Everything I had there was unavailable. Facebook cut me off. All kinds of things have happened. And now it's exploding all over Twitter. I'm at Judyth. That's at JUDYTH. I'm able to put up everything about COVID, all about the various things, anything I want to say about assassination. It's all coming there, and people are just flocking to it. We really have a chance now on Twitter.
It's beyond Twitter, Judyth.
Well, I'm just saying I'm having that personal experience.
Good. There are cycles, okay? And, it was very interesting. The conferences, the powers that be really tried to shut the conferences down after the 50th. They didn't want any more after they figured, okay, it's going to be done. But, we're a bunch of stubborn people here, and we keep at it. And I love the thought of continuing to celebrate JFK. They thought that they killed him, okay? But his spirit continues to live.
Yes.
His spirit continues to motivate people. The ideal of America, of having, not being told what to do by a king or a pope, but being told what to do by the people, is a correct idea, is a correct way to walk here. My humble opinion. And so now, Christopher, I'd like you to talk a little bit about what you've all heard here.
I think that everybody brings something to the table on this discussion. And President Kennedy's speech in Fort Worth that was never given was going to be talking about misinformation and disinformation. Also government reform and the fact that we needed leadership from individuals that have a great grasp on history, not flunkies that are come in and put into place, but somebody that actually has the people's heart in mind. That speech should have been given. It's a shame that we never got that speech, because Bobby Kennedy's intention in '64 was to get rid of all of these idiots in DC and throw them out. He'd already threatened every one of them. They were all going to go. Diem and New were assassinated, and he was furious. He'd had enough. And so he said, listen, all of you guys that are involved with that, all of you people that have affiliation to the City of London, all you people that were behind all these things that make my brother look ridiculous to the American public, you're all out of DC, Rockefellers, all of them. And they were scared to death about that because knew Bobby was going to do it. And so that was a big part of the fact that they pressed for the assassination in Dallas. They'd already had that place scouted out with our U-2 planes for 2 years. That was a very known site. Now, I don't know that it was specifically chosen for Kennedy before, but it was chosen for an assassination of any assassination of a foreign leader. They put Kennedy in that position, and they used that site for purpose. It was very well controlled.
Christopher, have you plans to publish or release more along the lines that you just described?
Well, I'll answer similar to the way Oliver Stone had answered when they asked about writing about the Federal Reserve. I do like to live. I do have a family, and I'd like to see them grow up. I don't want them to be without a father. I've already paid an enormous price of time and effort so far. I have been contacted recently about getting the book to all of the January 6ers that are doing time in prison to help them for what they're going through. I've been through that, and so that I could, if we get the book to them, maybe sign some things to them, I think that would be inspirational for them. I feel tragic for them, and I feel embarrassed as an American that they're going through that. I would like to write a second book. I really would. There's so much that I'd like to address, but it does weigh heavily on my mind. There is a price to pay when you cross the intelligence services, but that is the problem of our nation. My family has those same agreements that they're signed. They don't want to do without their mortgage and their nice house and their kids' college educations, everything else. That national security agreement that we got from the British is what's holding all of these good Americans back. They're not speaking about what they need to speak about to the American public. An uninformed public can be pushed in any direction. It can be fooled and can be tricked. And that's exactly what we're in store for in this nation, because we're not informed. An informed public cannot be treated in such a way. And that's what we really need to do. All of us together are helping that effort.
Yes, we all, it behooves us to do our homework, and so that we can't be shuffled down the wrong hallway. William, you have any thoughts here? We're going to be, we've just got a few minutes here going on. Let's start with you and give you some last thoughts, William.
You know, when I got into this thing, I bought the official line. Lee Harvey Oswald shot Kennedy. A man in a building shot a man in a car, and it changed history. It was only after I started reading books on the situation years later that I found out that's not true. That if you delve underneath this story, the official story, you find a whole different America. It's an underbelly of ugliness that people don't want to look at, and it scares them. It scares me. There's a lot of time when I wish I didn't know what I know. Sometimes it's more comfortable to just go, oh, okay, that's what they say, and so that's the government says that, and so the government wouldn't lie to us, and we'll just go along. And I'm a patriot, and red, white, and blue, and God bless America, my country, right or wrong. And I've learned that if we're not careful, if we don't question everything the government does and says, we're going to wind up where there's absolutely no freedom. We're headed there fast. And I believe the breakthrough for the other side came on the day that they killed JFK. I don't like thinking that. I don't like knowing that, but I know it. And so now I can't go back. All I can do is trudge forward and do the best I can, to the best of my ability. And that's what gets me up every day.
Amen. Jim, your last thoughts here.
Well, my thoughts are it's worth not just reading my book, but getting into that information because it's so relevant to NATO, nuclear weapons, like with Ukraine, the COVID, the weaponized cancer project versus the COVID, the January 6th versus the conservative segregationists back in the 60s versus the right-wing people today. I mean, when you really understand the Kennedy assassination, you really only for the first time understand the American government, for better or worse.
Amen. Judyth,
Well said.
Judyth,
Yes.
some thoughts here. Last thoughts.
Yes, I actually, only 2 days ago, the North Texas, the College of Law, I had to give a deposition under oath in front of university law students and with attorneys interrogating me. It was beautiful. It came out beautifully. God placed me to do this deposition that was filmed on the very spot where Lee Harvey Oswald was shot. Can you imagine the hand of God defending Lee Oswald in front of all these law students?
Wonderful.
Will that be posted and available to the public?
It will be eventually released. Yes, it will.
Wonderful. Paul and Liz, your last thoughts here today.
Well, I would say that, obviously we're all making whatever contribution we're capable of. And I think, and that's why I did like to emphasize that the fact that JFK in death probably may have become even more powerful. I believe that he was willing to accept that. I think that was part of his, of what was so obvious. And that, that the fact that he was a Fitzgerald, and that if you look at the history of what happened, that's why I brought up the genocide against the Fitzgerald by the Elizabethans. Gerald Fitzgerald, the last Earl of Desmond, was beheaded 1583, and that was considered the year of the start of the British Empire. I think that the connection to the Fitzgeralds and London is very powerful. And what we would like to believe is that the 400 years since that decimation is now the rising of the pure power of the Fitzgerald legacy, which is to try to heal the world.
Amen. Christopher, your last thoughts.
I'm very proud of the great men and women that started this nation as something different, as something special, something unique. And I think we should all be proud of that heritage. And I think we need to take that mantle up and become stronger men and women to the challenge that's been put before all of us.
Amen. Amen. Mr. Haslam, you've been at this a long time. You sat on Dr. Mary Sherman's lap. I love New Orleans. What's that statement? The Kennedy assassination went through New Orleans like a freight train or something?
I've done everything I can do, with the exception of participating in the making of a movie about this, okay? Which is the only other real goal I have on it. Unfortunately, I have a producer that wants to make the movie. I'm waiting to see what happens on that. I mean, some things are in our favor right now, which is the fact that we have all these different outlets. I mean, we used to only have 3 networks, and then we had, you had to get into the theaters, and they were all controlled by the same guy, and now you've got Amazon, you got all these different platforms out there, so that there's much less centralized control, even though they're still trying to control things centrally. But we have more opportunity today than we've had before. And I promise you, when I started out my journey on this, I was alone. And I no longer feel alone,
Oh, good.
It's good.
Good. Bruce, some thoughts?
Yeah, on my YouTube channel, Bruce de Torres, people will find recordings I did reading the speeches that JFK had planned for lunch and then dinner on the 22nd. Christopher mentioned those before, so if you want to hear those are there. And thanks.
Again, I really want to thank all you folks for, your time, because, you didn't have to do this. You could be doing something else. I really appreciate it. And to Ed's comment about movies, I mean, they've tried to stop me a bunch of times from being a publisher and getting these books out there. But, I just—
You're a hero to me. You are a hero.
Thank you. Well, I just love books because, they just sit there and, silently, but, books change people's lives. But not everybody reads books. Okay. And, I've had some dealings with Hollywood in trying to make some of these things into movies. And it was just incredible. I mean, this guy, he was the executive producer for 24. And he saw how they were using 24 in a propagandic way against the American people. And he looked around to find honest works. He came across our collection and he wanted to try and make them into movies. And he tried. And I mean, I'd get a call and he'd say, well, they're trying to get me fired. They're putting a rumor out there that I'm out on Sunset selling OxyContin at night. But his boss knew that wasn't true. He had a bunch of other calls, different things happened. And finally, one time he called me up and says, well, I've got to take a sabbatical for a couple of weeks. And I say, why? And he says, well, somebody met my wife on a street corner and told her that, we don't like what your husband's doing. And if he doesn't stop, we're going to kill him. And then what are your children going to do? Okay. Because some people read books, but not everybody, but everybody goes to the movies. Okay. So we need to, continually push forward, try our hardest so that our children can have a better world. And again, thank you all for coming. Amen. And onwards to a better future.
Definitely.
God bless everybody here. Thank you.